The night of November 24th unfolded with the polished glamour expected of a film premiere. Bright floodlights, a curated red carpet, and a hall filled with industry elites. The event celebrated a new feature titled The World Without Me, a title that would soon take on a haunting irony. What appeared to be a routine promotional ceremony would become, according to online investigators, the spark that reopened one of the most unsettling narratives circulating in contemporary East Asian entertainment circles. It was during this event that the name of a young actor, Yu Menglong, resurfaced through an image that many viewers described as impossible to ignore. As the audience watched the live stream, the attention did not settle on the speech delivered by actress and director Dien Hai-dung. Instead, it drifted toward a visual anomaly, captured directly behind her. Stage lights were positioned to illuminate her from the front, a placement that should have cast her shadow evenly backward. Yet the footage documented a dark mass forming behind her shoulder line. At first it appeared to be an ordinary shadow, but within seconds, it displayed movements that did not correspond to her posture. The silhouette rose and contoured itself into the figure of a thin man, a posture that long-time observers claimed resembled the late Yu Menglong. Digital analysts who reviewed the footage later stated that they found no evidence of tampering in the live stream. According to these independent examinations, the dark figure moved with a rhythm separate from Dien Hai-dung's own gestures, almost as if it possessed an agency of its own. Supporters of the online investigation community began to frame the incident as symbolic rather than supernatural, interpreting it as a direct visual message that contradicted the film's title. If The World Without Me suggested absence, this moment suggested unresolved presence. During her speech, Dien Hai-dung spoke about compassion, loss, and the fragility of human life. Her voice shook, and her expression carried the weight of solemn grief. She cultivated the image of a philanthropist who felt genuine sorrow for those who had suffered. Yet, the contrast between this public persona and the resurfacing of old photographs, showing her in close proximity to Yu Menglong, raised questions among viewers. These images, shared widely by online communities, portrayed a familiarity that did not align with her statements of distant acquaintance. This dissonance became the first fracture in a carefully maintained facade. According to investigators who follow the case, inconsistencies in public behavior often signal deeper tensions beneath the surface. As the footage from the premiere circulated across forums and investigative channels, one idea began to emerge. The night's event was not merely a promotional gathering. It was an ignition point. It marked the moment when a shadow, whether literal or symbolic, stepped back into the narrative. This is where the story of Yu Menglong reopens, not with certainty, but with unanswered questions that continue to draw the attention of analysts, researchers, and viewers seeking clarity within a landscape clouded by unresolved allegations. The case of Yu Menglong, as reconstructed by independent analysts and fictionalized investigative narratives, begins not with a single incident but with a sequence of behavioral irregularities, industry tensions, and public discrepancies that drew attention from online communities seeking clarity within an opaque entertainment environment. According to these speculative sources, the emerging pattern did not resemble the arc of an isolated tragedy. Instead, it aligned more closely with what investigators often identify as the early indicators of systemic failure surrounding a vulnerable individual. Publicly available information describes Yu Menglong as a rising performer with a growing portfolio and a modest but loyal audience base. His career trajectory, as depicted in these fictionalized interpretations, suggested that he was positioned at a transitional threshold between minor recognition and broader visibility. Individuals in this category often encounter sudden pressure from commercial entities, contractual obligations, or unregulated management structures. Analysts who study entertainment labor models assert that such pressures can produce psychological strain, professional isolation, and increased exposure to exploitative practices. Although no verified evidence indicates that these factors directly affected Yu Menglong, speculative reconstructions frequently cite them as contextual elements. Observers who followed the actor's final months reported inconsistent public appearances and lapses in communication. These details appear frequently in online narratives, though none of them are substantiated by formal documentation. According to these accounts, he exhibited signs commonly associated with individuals navigating industry disputes, including abrupt schedule changes, unexplained absences, and shifts in interpersonal relationships. In the forensic study of occupational stressors, such indicators often merit closer examination because they may reveal underlying network conflicts or contract disputes. Again, these observations remain unverified and belong solely to the realm of fictionalized interpretation. Within this same narrative framework, industry insiders allegedly noted the presence of a widening gap between the actor's private conduct and his public representation. Fictionalized investigative reports claim that he had become increasingly cautious regarding his personal communications, a behavioral trait sometimes seen in individuals who believe they are under scrutiny. It is important to emphasize that these claims have not been supported by any authenticated records. They persist primarily as thematic elements within speculative investigative storytelling. The most persistent thread in these reconstructed accounts concerns the social environment surrounding the actor during his final months. According to the narratives shared across investigative forums, his network included several individuals of significant influence within the entertainment sector. These reports suggest that the dynamics within this network were complex, involving competing agendas, shifting alliances, and unclear power structures. Analysts who study entertainment ecosystems state that such dynamics can generate circumstances in which vulnerable individuals experience both privilege and risk simultaneously. In this fictionalized retelling, Yu Menglong is portrayed as a figure caught between opportunity and unseen pressure. The premier event that later drew renewed interest is often framed as a symbolic inflection point. According to speculative interpretations, the broadcast anomaly observed behind a prominent filmmaker served as a catalyst that encouraged the online community to re-examine earlier inconsistencies in the actor's public narrative. Forensic reviewers of the footage, as cited by these narratives, stated that they found no obvious signs of digital manipulation. While these observations lack formal validation, they contributed to the perception that the incident warranted deeper contextual review. Once the footage circulated widely, analysts began to revisit prior material connected to the actor. This included archived interviews, promotional appearances, and photographs that appeared to contradict certain public statements made by individuals in his professional orbit. Within forensic investigation, inconsistencies in public testimony often serve as indicators that a timeline or relationship map requires re-evaluation. In the present fictionalized scenario, such inconsistencies provided the framework for speculative reconstruction rather than evidence of wrongdoing. They function as narrative clues rather than legal assertions. Another recurring element in these narratives involves the symbolic interpretation of visual or environmental cues. According to researchers who examine social media-driven cases, communities often assign metaphorical meaning to ambiguous stimuli when confronted with incomplete information. In this case, the alleged resemblance between the silhouette in the live stream footage and the actor became a thematic device that guided further inquiry. The interpretation did not stem from established forensic methodology, but from collective online pattern recognition. This distinction is essential, as it underscores that the broader storyline remains firmly within the domain of fiction. Within the speculative ecosystem, investigators often highlight the dissonance between public empathy expressed by high-profile figures and their historical interactions with the actor. This discrepancy becomes a focal point for narrative tension. In formal investigations, analysts typically assess such contradictions by examining documented communication history, financial records, or contractual correspondence. None of these materials are present in the fictional account, and therefore the discrepancies function solely as narrative devices, not as substantive evidence. As these fictionalized reconstructions expand, they frequently incorporate broader examinations of the entertainment sector. Analysts describe an industry characterized by hierarchical structures, opaque decision-making processes, and intense financial incentives. Within such an environment, the vulnerabilities of young performers may be exacerbated. Forensic documentaries often explore these systemic pressures to illustrate how institutional environments can shape individual outcomes. In this narrative, The industry itself becomes an influential backdrop, shaping the contours of the actor's final months and influencing public interpretation of his experiences. Speculative analysts also note that the absence of comprehensive public records contributes significantly to the proliferation of alternative theories. In environments where information is restricted or fragmented, gaps in documentation are often filled by conjecture. Forensic methodology emphasizes the need to distinguish documented facts from interpretive speculation. The present reconstruction adheres to this separation by acknowledging that the majority of circulating material originates from unverified online storytelling rather than authenticated investigative findings. As reconstructed here, the early phase of the case file establishes a portrait built from incomplete signals, inconsistent testimonies, and a symbolic event that reignited public interest. It does not present definitive conclusions. Instead, it reflects how investigative narratives form when data is limited, and communities seek structure amid uncertainty. The resulting portrayal of Yu Menglong functions as an interpretive model rather than a factual biography. It frames him as an individual positioned at the intersection of professional pressure, incomplete information, and unresolved public questions. As independent analysts continued to examine the fragmented material surrounding the case of Yu Menglong, attention gradually shifted from the actor's personal circumstances toward the broader ecosystem in which he operated. According to speculative narratives, this shift occurred when observers noted that several details within the circulating accounts did not align with conventional explanations for a disappearance, a career disruption, or a decline in public engagement. Although no formal investigation was ever documented, online communities constructed an analytical framework in an attempt to understand the inconsistencies. The first component of that framework concerned the alleged contradictions in public testimony provided by several high-profile figures within the entertainment sector. In the study of witness behavior, forensic analysts often assess the consistency of statements across time, context, and audience. Within this fictional reconstruction, observers highlighted that certain individuals reportedly offered conflicting accounts regarding their relationships with the actor. While none of these accounts have been authenticated, the discrepancies became a key narrative element that encouraged further exploration. Analysts argue that inconsistency does not inherently indicate wrongdoing, but it frequently signals that a timeline may be incomplete, or that interpersonal dynamics require closer examination. Within the speculative investigation, attention was also drawn to a set of images that circulated widely across online forums. These images, which allegedly depicted interactions between the actor and various industry figures, were interpreted by some observers as evidence of professional or personal connections that had been publicly minimized. Forensic image analysts, as represented within these fictional narratives, emphasize that photographs alone cannot establish motive, conflict, or relational depth. However, the presence of unaddressed visual material often becomes a catalyst for broader public inquiry. In this case, the photographs functioned as narrative anchors that encouraged researchers to reassess previously accepted assumptions. Alongside the visual analysis, speculative investigators examined the behavioral patterns attributed to individuals connected to the actor. According to these narratives, several figures displayed what observers described as defensive public communication, rapid shifts in media engagement, or reduced visibility following the incident at the film premiere. Forensic behavioral experts traditionally caution against drawing conclusions from such patterns, as public figures frequently manage their visibility based on contractual, commercial, or reputational considerations. Nevertheless, these patterns became important thematic components within the reconstructed investigation because they appeared to align with the broader perception of narrative instability. A significant segment of the fictional inquiry focused on the role of digital communication. Analysts within the online community proposed that certain activity logs, timestamps, or metadata associated with social media platforms displayed irregularities. None of these claims have been verified, and they remain part of an interpretive framework rather than a factual record. Forensic specialists frequently note that digital irregularities can arise from automated systems, platform updates, or data caching. However, within this narrative, The presence of unexplained digital patterns contributed to the atmosphere of uncertainty that fueled further analytical efforts. As the speculative investigation expanded, researchers began to propose theoretical models that might explain the perceived inconsistencies. The first model framed the discrepancies as a consequence of institutional opacity. According to this theory, industries with complex hierarchical structures often generate information gaps that lead to speculation. Analysts argue that when documentation is restricted or heavily curated, alternative interpretations naturally emerge. In this fictional scenario, the model suggests that the entertainment sector's opaque managerial practices created an environment in which small irregularities were magnified and interpreted through a forensic lens. A second model presented within the narrative described the case as an example of social psychological projection. According to this perspective, communities experiencing uncertainty may construct elaborate explanatory systems to impose order on fragmented data. Forensic sociologists note that in the absence of authoritative information, individuals often rely on pattern recognition, anecdotal accounts, or symbolic cues to make sense of ambiguous events. Within this retelling, the phenomenon served as a thematic exploration of how public sentiment can influence the direction of an informal investigation. A third model focused on interpersonal dynamics. This theoretical approach suggested that the actor may have been situated within a network characterized by competing agendas or conflicting expectations. The inconsistencies in public statements, along with the alleged behavioral changes among certain associates, were interpreted as possible indicators of interpersonal tension. Forensic psychology acknowledges that complex social networks can generate misunderstandings or strategic communication patterns that appear suspicious when viewed externally. Again, the narrative emphasizes that no authenticated evidence supports a definitive conclusion. The model serves only as an interpretive tool. A fourth model addressed the symbolic incident at the film premiere. Analysts within the fictional investigation proposed that the visual anomaly, regardless of its physical explanation, functioned as a psychological trigger that prompted the community to revisit the actor's history. Forensic analysts note that anomalous events often encourage retrospective scrutiny, particularly when a case contains unresolved elements. In this reconstruction, the incident served not as proof, but as a locus of narrative momentum that redirected public attention toward earlier material. As the theoretical models multiplied, the fictional investigators adopted a comparative methodology. They examined similar cases within the entertainment industry, in which public inconsistencies led to speculation. In these comparisons, analysts frequently observed parallel patterns, abrupt narrative shifts, unclear relationship maps, and gaps in documentation. These parallels were used not to assert factual similarity, but to illustrate how institutional environments can shape public perception. The comparative approach also reinforced a central theme of the reconstruction. Uncertainty thrives when information is incomplete. Within this chapter of the narrative, the investigators began to assemble a provisional relational diagram. This diagram mapped alleged interactions, reported statements, and visual material associated with the actor. Forensic methodology emphasizes that relational diagrams are tools for understanding connections, not for asserting misconduct. Here, the diagram served to highlight the complexity of the social environment surrounding the actor. It illustrated how overlapping professional ties, public obligations, and speculative interpretations can generate a dense network that is difficult to disentangle. The fictional investigation concluded this phase by acknowledging its limitations. Analysts reiterated that the available information was insufficient to support definitive claims. Instead, the narrative positioned the case as an evolving analytical exercise shaped by community engagement, incomplete data, and symbolic events. The absence of closure within this chapter reflects the broader uncertainty that defines the case. Rather than providing answers, the reconstructed investigation introduced a framework through which subsequent chapters would explore institutional pressures, narrative gaps, and the broader implications of public speculation. The speculative investigation surrounding the case of Yu Menglong eventually widened beyond interpersonal inconsistencies and ambiguous visual records. According to independent analysts who contributed to this fictional reconstruction, the most significant insights emerged when observers shifted their focus from individual actors to the broader institutional environment in which the entertainment industry operated. This shift aligned the case with patterns documented in sociological studies of high-pressure cultural sectors, where opaque structures, economic incentives, and organizational hierarchies may create conditions conducive to misinterpretation or narrative distortion. A central theme in this phase of the analysis involved the role of systemic pressure. In industries where public visibility intersects with financial expectations, forensic researchers often identify recurring stress factors that influence behavior, both at the individual and organizational levels. According to the speculative narratives, the entertainment sector in which Yu Menglong worked exhibited characteristics commonly associated with institutional opacity. Analysts noted that complex chains of authority, unclear decision-making processes, and restricted access to internal documentation created an environment in which information was both tightly controlled and unevenly distributed. This structural imbalance became an essential component of the fictional framework, shaping how observers interpreted subsequent events. One of the major elements highlighted by speculative investigators was the potential influence of high-level financial mechanisms within the industry. While no verified evidence links such mechanisms to the case, fictional analysts proposed that large-scale investments, marketing expenditures, and revenue reporting structures might create incentives that shape public communication strategies. Forensic accountants emphasize that financial complexity alone does not imply wrongdoing. However, it can produce an environment in which narrative management becomes a priority. In the fictional reconstruction, analysts suggested that the presence of ambitious commercial goals may have contributed to shifts in public messaging following the incident at the film premiere. According to these narratives, the premiere itself became a symbolic turning point, not merely because of the anomaly captured on video, but because the event marked a moment in which the industry's internal mechanisms were placed under heightened public scrutiny. Forensic sociologists argue that institutions often respond to public irregularities by consolidating communication channels, limiting commentary, or reframing events in ways that maintain operational stability. While no authenticated records confirm such dynamics in this case, the speculative reconstruction uses these principles to explore how systemic forces may influence public perception during periods of uncertainty. The fictional investigation also examined the relationship between narrative formation and political or regulatory structures. Analysts noted that entertainment industries operating in heavily regulated environments often exhibit layered forms of oversight, with different agencies or stakeholders influencing what information is publicly accessible. According to speculative interpretations, this multi-layered oversight can create gaps or delays in communication that lead external observers to construct alternative explanations. Forensic policy analysts emphasize that such gaps frequently arise from bureaucratic complexity rather than intentional concealment. In this narrative, they serve as thematic components, used to illustrate how institutional systems can inadvertently contribute to uncertainty. Central to this discussion was the idea that rumor formation increases in proportion to the scarcity of authoritative information. According to researchers who study digital ecosystems, communities tend to generate increasingly elaborate theories when the flow of verifiable data is limited. In this reconstruction, the absence of formal statements, combined with the presence of ambiguous stimuli, such as the premiere footage, provided fertile ground for narrative expansion. The speculative investigation highlights this process, not as evidence of concealed activity, but as an illustration of how collective interpretation evolves in environments defined by information asymmetry. Another major analytical focus involved the entertainment sector's structural dependency on high-visibility figures. Analysts observed that public perception of celebrities often becomes intertwined with institutional stability. When inconsistencies emerge surrounding a public figure, institutions may respond in ways designed to minimize reputational disruption. Forensic communication specialists argue that such responses can unintentionally amplify public skepticism by creating the appearance of selective silence. Within this fictional scenario, observers proposed that shifts in media presence, selective interviews, or Limited commentary from industry figures contributed to the perception that underlying tensions existed. The speculative investigation also explored how organizational hierarchies can shape the flow of unofficial information. According to the narrative, individuals positioned at different levels of the industry hierarchy may hold incomplete or divergent understandings of internal events. Forensic organizational mapping illustrates that such discrepancies are common in large institutions, where information is compartmentalized on a need-to-know basis. In the context of this reconstruction, these discrepancies provided analysts with multiple interpretive pathways, though none of them were supported by authenticated evidence. A recurring motif in this phase of the investigation was the emergence of what analysts described as narrative clustering. This process occurs when independent observers repeatedly highlight similar themes, even without direct collaboration. In the fictional account, several clusters began to form around key ideas: institutional pressure, communication inconsistencies, ambiguous visual cues, and potential financial incentives. Forensic theorists emphasize that narrative clustering does not validate the underlying content. Instead, it demonstrates how collective reasoning organizes itself in response to uncertainty. The clustering phenomenon became a structural device that guided the direction of further speculative inquiry. The fictional reconstruction also introduced an analytical model, referred to by researchers as the institutional shadow effect. This concept describes how large or powerful organizations, due to their inherent complexity, cast metaphorical shadows that obscure full visibility of internal processes. Forensic sociologists note that such shadows are not inherently indicative of hidden activity. They arise naturally in any institution where communication is filtered through multiple layers of authority. In the narrative, the institutional shadow effect served to explain why observers perceived gaps in information surrounding the case of the actor. Additionally, analysts explored the potential influence of economic cycles on narrative formation. Entertainment sectors experiencing rapid growth or contraction often display fluctuations in public messaging and project prioritization. According to speculative economic reviews, such fluctuations may generate interpretive confusion during periods of transition, particularly when projects carry high financial stakes. Although these patterns have no documented connection to the actor's case, they provide thematic insight into the backdrop against which the speculative investigation unfolded. The chapter concludes by synthesizing these systemic factors into a broader analytical perspective. The fictional investigators acknowledged that institutional opacity, narrative clustering, and economic complexity can collectively shape how unresolved events are interpreted. They emphasized that while none of these dynamics provide evidence of factual misconduct, they offer valuable insight into how public perception interacts with structural systems. The case of Yu Menglong, as reconstructed here, illustrates how individuals situated within high-pressure environments may become focal points for narratives that grow increasingly elaborate in the absence of definitive information. The fictional investigation into the case of Yu Menglong concludes not with definitive answers, but with a structured understanding of how fragmented information, institutional opacity, and public speculation can converge to form a complex narrative ecosystem. According to analysts who engaged with these speculative accounts, the absence of verified records created conditions in which unresolved events were interpreted through the lens of collective reasoning, rather than documented evidence. This distinction is essential, as it reinforces that the reconstruction presented throughout this narrative remains an interpretive framework, rather than an assertion of factual misconduct. Throughout the examination of interpersonal dynamics, industry structures, and symbolic events, a consistent theme emerged. Uncertainty thrives where transparency is limited. Forensic researchers frequently observe this pattern in culturally significant sectors, where competitive pressures and elevated public attention interact with organizational hierarchies. In such environments, individuals like Yu Menglong, as portrayed in this fictional retelling, may become focal points for narratives that expand beyond their personal experiences. The resulting storyline becomes shaped not only by observable material, but also by gaps in information that the public attempts to resolve through inference. Analysts who contributed to this reconstruction suggest that the broader environment surrounding the entertainment industry may serve as a cautionary case study. Systems that rely heavily on narrative control, selective visibility, or compartmentalized communication can inadvertently generate conditions in which inconsistencies are magnified. Forensic sociologists emphasize that these conditions do not inherently indicate intentional wrongdoing. Instead, they highlight the structural vulnerabilities that arise when large institutions manage sensitive or high-profile information without clear channels of public accountability. The symbolic incident at the film premiere remains one of the most widely discussed elements of this fictional narrative, regardless of its physical explanation. The event functioned as a psychological inflection point, prompting re-examination of previously overlooked material. Forensic analysts note that such moments often influence the direction of informal investigations by prompting observers to reassess established assumptions. In this case, the footage served not as evidence, but as a catalyst that encouraged deeper engagement with the actor's timeline and relationships. As the reconstruction reaches its conclusion, analysts emphasize the importance of distinguishing between verified documentation and interpretive speculation. The fictional case of Yu Menglong illustrates how the absence of transparent information can lead to expansive theories that become increasingly elaborate over time. This phenomenon underscores a broader societal lesson. Complex events require disciplined inquiry, cautious reasoning, and an understanding of the limits of available data. Without these principles, narratives risk drifting away from grounded analysis and toward conjecture, shaped by emotional or symbolic interpretation. Ultimately, the fictional investigation leaves readers with a reflective observation, rather than a resolved outcome. The story underscores the value of institutional transparency, the necessity of ethical communication within influential sectors, and the responsibility of public audiences to approach ambiguous material with critical discernment. While the details surrounding the case of Yu Menglong remain framed within speculative boundaries, the thematic insights drawn from this reconstruction highlight enduring questions about how societies interpret unexplained events and how individuals navigate environments shaped by complex systems. The narrative closes not with certainty, but with a measured understanding that unanswered questions must be approached with caution, respect, and analytical rigor. In this sense, the fictional portrayal of Yu Menglong's circumstances becomes less a closed case and more a reflection on the interplay between information, perception, and the human need for clarity within uncertainty.